As far as our schedule goes, we do meet next Tuesday. In 2 weeks, we don't meet, if you see on the schedule, the 18th, and that's because I have all these grandchildren are going to be out of school that week, and I think they're going to need me. And then after that, we meet straight through to April, I think it is. Or right through to the end of May. I don't know if there's any gaps after that.
April 14th?
Do I have that down?
Yeah, May.
It's Easter week?
Yeah, that's Easter week.
Easter week?
Yes.
Easter week, yes, there is a gap, yes, April 14th is the next gap, right, okay. But we meet next week, that's the main message. Okay, so we're into St. Paul. We read the beginning, the introduction, and with Paul's long description of his own standing, because this is the one letter to a congregation that he did not found, and that where he's never been. He had never been to Rome. In fact, as far as we know, he didn't speak Latin. He spoke Aramaic and Greek. But in the Roman Empire, the major cities, you would have a number of languages. You'd have Greek speakers and Latin speakers all in Rome, and the same thing in Jerusalem. You'd hear Aramaic, Latin, and Greek all there. And I want to emphasize, as we go through this letter, as I do with all of Paul's letters, is that if you are reading and you're having difficulty with when he changes topics or transition, it's because one of the reasons is not only does he write very long sentences and his thought is at a very high level, but we're also reading somebody else's very old mail. This letter wasn't written to us. Paul had no idea that 2,000 years later we'd be picking up the letter that he's dictating to the Roman churches, the house churches. And when you write a letter to your friend or to a church or whatever, there's certain things that all of you understand that don't need to be explained in the letter. But when someone reads it 2,000 years later, the backdrop, the context is completely different, right? So that's why sometimes you can get lost in the letter and you wonder, what is he talking about? Who is he referring to? We're reading somebody else's very old mail. So we saw the introduction where he gives a self-description, and not only that, he gives a very short description of what we call the kerygma, or the proclamation. We saw it, and it's a thumbnail sketch of what it was that any evangelist went out and said. We're set apart for the gospel of God, and here's the kerygma, which he promised beforehand through his prophets. So this is fulfillment, the life and death and resurrection of Jesus is fulfillment of the prophets. The gospel occurring his son, who was descended from David according to the flesh and was declared to be Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection of the dead. Jesus Christ, our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith. There's the kerygma. That's why his gospel matters. That Jesus was the son of David. That he lived. That he was God. That he lived, died, and rose from the dead. See it? And then we talked about the themes. The theme of uprightness, or this very hard word, dikaiosune, and I only put it up in Greek because everybody, all scholars, wrestle with it, and no one can agree. Should you translate it righteousness, uprightness, or justice? They all work. But the main thing is, if you understand that the righteousness is of God and not of man. The Jews believed if you followed the law, you were a righteous person. In fact, read Psalm 1. Blessed are those who sit not in the counsels of the wicked, but blessed are the righteousness who follow the law, the righteous people. As if you could be a righteous person just by following the law. And Paul's going to contradict that. He's going to say the law is good as far as it goes, but it can never make us righteous. Because once you know the law, and being human, you break the law. So we talked about that, and each of us in our translations is going to have a different translation for that. it's also, I should have I'll put in a fourth one, is because this came up in the Reformation. How does a person become justified? And that means made forgiven of sins and made upright. So another translation is justification. Isn't this confusing? I have to tell you about it though. And there it is. Oh, I have it here, right. But there's the Greek of it, dikaiosis. So, and then we talk about the major themes of the whole book. Justification is the main theme, but also equally so is salvation and freedom. The freedom that comes through the grace of Jesus Christ. And we'll talk about freedom from what? There's so much in Romans. And then we talked about God's uprightness versus God's wrath or judgment, right? And then when we got to where we stopped is at the beginning of his introduction, after his introduction and his thanksgiving, he gives us that theme sentence. I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and to the Greek. And we know these congregations had at the Eucharistic meal former pagan Greeks, elbow to elbow, with very law-observant former Jews who had been Christians. And that was causing a friction, and he's going to deal with that. And for it is in the righteousness of God, it is revealed through faith for faith. Remember this? Very hard. Scholars struggle with this one. Ek pistis, eis pistis in Greek. And the best explanation, and I looked in many commentaries of several, through a beginning faith, which becomes the means for a person to share in salvation, and then going forward in faith, you begin to bear fruit for the kingdom, so that it's real. Another way to say it is through faith for faithfulness. Once we believe, that's a moment in our lives, and then after that, we reconvert ourselves so that we can participate in God's plan, which makes us faithful. Right? So that seems to be the best explanation of Paul saying, through faith, for faith. And then salvation is another thing he said there, is that salvation is redefined. It is no longer a matter of the law, but a matter of faith from the start to finish. And that's really different for the Jewish converts in the Roman congregations. That's brand new. It's not about what the deeds of the law. I did this, I did this, I did this, right? You could never get righteous that way. You should do it, but it won't make, only God is fully righteous, and he, through his grace, he can make you righteous because of your faith. So he says...
How did he get, I'm sorry, how did he get to that information? Like, was it through prayer, dream, or how did he get that information?
The question is, how did Paul come to the... He was a zealous Jew. He persecuted people who didn't fulfill all the deeds of the law. Right. Wonderful question. From Acts of the Apostles, we see at 3 different points, Jesus appears or speaks to Paul, and it is beyond reason. His encounter with Christ completely humbles him. He no longer is the zealous Jew who's chasing after people and killing them, or locking them up. He was there at the martyrdom of Stephen. It doesn't say he participated, but it says he was holding people's cloaks while they stoned the first martyr. Why? Because in the very beginning, Paul believed that this subset of Judaism was blasphemy. To say that a human being is God is blasphemy, and the punishment for blasphemy was stoning. And so he's done, because of it, it's supernatural what happened to Paul. The encounter with Christ changed him completely. And remember, he couldn't see after the first encounter, and someone had to lead him to the street called Straight in Damascus. And then he met Ananias, and God had already spoken Jesus had spoken to Ananias to expect Paul, and this firebrand anti-Christian, and he gets baptized by Ananias, and laying on of hands, and the scales fall off his eyes. He has had a total, complete, direct experience of Christ and a revision of his whole mind and soul and heart. It's absolutely total. I once heard Father Benedict Rochelle talk about conversion. He said most of us were raised as Christians or Catholic Christians, and little by little we're converted in the sense that we receive our grown-up faith and we are reaffirmed. But he said in the religious order that he founded, the Franciscans, what do they call it, the renewal, he had many young women and young men coming in, and he said, I can't describe it to you. They've been everywhere. They've done every sin there is to be, and they found it empty, and they've decided that they want to follow Christ, and it's so incredible to me. I can only describe it as direct intervention. Well, that's what happened to St. Paul, direct intervention. God showed up in his heart and mind and took over. It's the only way I could, it's mysterious how that could happen. It's a miracle, right? But when you read Acts, it's described once, it's described again, and it's described a third time. By the end, you really see that God visited him, and he gave him a great grace, is what he did. So salvation got redefined as no longer a matter of law, but of faith from start to finish. And God's righteousness, or however you want to translate it, justice or uprightness, is disclosed only in the sphere of faith. So at the point that Paul knew that Jesus was talking straight to him and said, why are you persecuting me? He understood a whole new vision of what is God's righteousness, and that he couldn't do it. He could receive it only to the point that he believed that Jesus was God. And then he got the grace, and that I like to think of it as God's giving us a holy coat, that his righteousness is like a suit of armor, and he gives it to us because we're people of prayer, because we believe. And the more we believe, and the more we are faithful, the more we stay in touch with him, the more grace and righteousness it's not that we're good of ourselves, it's all, we're the hollow vessel that we're allowing him to fill. I hope that makes sense. So today we stopped at 118. So just to go to look at the whole letter from 30,000 feet, we're right here. Well, so remember we have the doctrinal section, and then we have the encouraging section, or the hortatory, the sermon. It is the sermon. And then we get his travel plans and a blessing, and then we get a recommendation for Phoebe, the first deaconess, and we get greetings, and it's in these greetings that we find out so much about the house churches of Rome. And so he's going to talk to us now about the uprightness of God, or the justification of God, or the righteousness of God, and then how we get his righteousness, and that means we're justified. The word justified is big, because you think of justice, but it was helpful to me once when a Bible teacher, Mary Louise Schwering, said, you know when we used to use typewriters? And we still do word processing. Do you remember what a justified margin was? You made the words come all the way out to the edge. You filled the space. Well, it's that and so much more. We are made whole by God's grace, right? And he puts his righteousness on us, and we are justified. We're made, because we're all sinners, and we can't become justified any other
Is
way.
that like saying we're made in the image and likeness of God?
But we start out that way, and then because of freedom and free will, we turn away here and there, right? And so we're kind of like riddled with corruption, or Swiss cheese or something. And God fills all those holes in. I know somebody who was born and raised a Catholic, and was, fulfilled all the things you're supposed to do when you're a Catholic. But the main interest in this woman's life was not God. And then she went through some trials and a divorce and some other things, sad things that happened in her life. And she was preparing a doctoral dissertation and went to an island off of Ireland, and it was like a divine intervention. All of a sudden she knew that God loved her, and she said the only way I can describe it, and now she's a nun, this woman, is that she said, I always kind of felt like there was something wrong, like I had a hole in my heart, and that hole is filled. And that's what justification is like. All our missing parts in God's grace can be filled. So I like the justified margin idea. So here's where we are, and if I flip this, and if I'm lucky enough to make it go over this. Okay, now that was the overview. We're down here. So he's gonna, this part, through the gospel, God's of uprightness, God is revealed as justifying the person of faith, right? And where we are right now, this was the theme announced. The gospel is a powerful source of salvation for all, disclosing Greeks and Jews. And he's going to pound on that because they're having trouble in these communities getting together. For all, disclosing God's uprightness. We can't do it ourselves. He's the upright or the righteous. And then, now here comes, he decides to hit them first with all of the corruption and sin in their society. And first he describes the general culture, a sinful sexual culture of Rome. And then he talks about God's wrath against the Gentiles and God's judgment against the Jews. And before then he's going to positively explain the theme of justification. And it's going to hit us hard, and he's going to say that all of the sinfulness is of the current society in Rome. And it was quite an open society, you know. If the senators in the Senate didn't like a certain consul or later an emperor, they knifed him. You know, think of Julius Caesar. Think of Nero, right? Just prostitution was legal. If you were in the upper classes, slavery there was 4 slaves for every freed person. In the upper class, the aristocratic classes, it was common for a father for a slave owner to use even though he was a married man, to use his slaves for sexual pleasure, male and female. And there were laws at certain times against adultery. You were supposed to marry and be faithful to your wife, but a slave wasn't a person, so that didn't count, right? Or maybe you went to a prostitute, but she wasn't married. The only thing wrong was if you used sexually another married person. That was about it. And there were laws against that sometimes in the Roman Empire, sometimes there weren't. So it was a very open society. And so he's going to hit the negative first, and before he gets to the positive explained in terms of Abram and lots of figures. And one thing I just want to hit on right here is Paul uses the term of the wrath of God, which we never do anymore. Do we ever talk about God's wrath? In Jesus, we learn that God is love, right? But we also know that Jesus said there's going to be, at the end of the era, or the end of the world, a judgment. But Paul is an Old Testament Jew. The New Testament isn't published yet. And so it's a Jewish verbiage to talk about God's wrath when what he's talking about is the just punishment of God against sinners. When he comes, and at the time of this writing, Paul believes that Jesus is coming very soon in judgment on the whole world, right? So, and in the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms and in the prophets, the idea was that they projected onto God the Father human attributes, and before he could punish somebody, he had to get really mad. You see it? Right? We don't talk about God like that anymore. But you will hear him talk about God, and all it means is God's just punishment. Later on. Okay. So,
Excuse me, Mary.
Yes.
So is there, in that context, is there a belief that that kind of punishment is inflicted on people contemporaneously with their life events?
in the Old Testament, yes, the idea was there was this cosmology where God is sitting on his throne above the dome of the sky, and he's Lord of history. There's some freedom, right, because of sin, right? But he's Lord of history, and everything that happens in the absence of science that we have today. If a person suddenly drops dead, or someone gets leprosy, no science behind it, right? Or if there's an earthquake or a volcano erupts, no science behind that. So all of that is, God is Lord of history, and he directs all that. And so in the Old Testament, the prophets and the Psalms, it is God's direct punishment. And they would even ask the question, in fact, the apostles asked Jesus at one point, the man born blind, was he born blind for his own sin or for his parents or grandparents? See it? They asked Jesus that, and Jesus says neither. So he contradicts that, right? But the interesting thing is, you will hear today amongst some very fundamentalist Christian groups, oh, you know, the coronavirus is God's punishment for this or that. Jesus said that wasn't true. But if you, so that we read the Old Testament as Christians with the light of the New Testament together, right? Because we do, but we don't throw away the Old Testament, right? Because there's so much good there. But we have to we have to interpret it based on a thorough knowledge of the New Testament and everything Jesus said. But you're going to hear that. Have you heard people say this? Oh, this is God. Oh, yes. But see, that if that were true, then no good people would suffer. But we know Jesus was a perfect person. He suffered. So suffering is part of our life in this world. And it has meaning. Okay. So let's pick up with, well, here comes the wrath of God. In other words, understand punishment of God. Who would like to read chapter 1, 18 through 23?
All right.
Thank you, Catherine.
The guilt of humankind. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of men, who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God, or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man or birds, or animals or reptiles.
Great, we stopped there. That's a lot. There's a huge amount in here. What stands out for you? Is there a new theme here that he starts with?
Well, the heading in my Bible says the guilt of humankind.
Yes, all mankind is guilty, you could summarize it. But when I get to the end of the first verse there, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. What is the truth? Brand new letter, brand new congregations he's writing to, and he says, who are the wicked people? They're the people who suppress the truth. Well, what's the truth? You have to ask that question. Well, he's going to tell us. If you look all the way down to verse 25, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. So the truth that Paul is going to argue that all of us are capable, even if we've never been taught, of knowing the truth about God. Now, how could that be? And look at verse 19. For what can be known about God is plain to them. And who are they? Everybody, he's going to say. The Jew first and the Gentile. Because God is shown to. So he's presenting something incredible. That God exists. There's no room for any atheist And that all of us can know God's truth because it's been shown to them. How has it been shown?
And creation.
Look out the window. Exactly. Creation. Exactly. Because God, ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. Ta onta, it says in Greek. I love this expression. Onta is the participial form of emi, the verb to be, of the things being, the things that are. All creation, everything that is. Paul is making the claim that if you look outside in his world, right, and it's true in his world, people believed in something. And maybe, in many gods, maybe in the God of Judaism, maybe in Christ, but there were very few people, or I don't even know if there were any, who believed in nothing. We have plenty of atheists and agnostics who say, I don't know, right? But that's because we have developed so much science that a lot of people have elevated the human mind to such a point that if I don't understand it, maybe it doesn't exist. But that lacks humility, right? That's the problem. The heart can know things that the head doesn't know. So what do we call, has anyone ever heard this? There's a name for this. That by a simple, even an uneducated and never evangelized person has to know, Paul says, by looking at the sky and the trees and the snow and the newborn babies, everything there is, the wonder of creation. What is that called? It has a name. Anyone know? It's called natural law.
Oh, yeah.
Natural law. And Paul is maybe the author, the originator of it. And he's saying you can't miss it. And he's right, because when we don't understand that we're small and the world is big and we can't encompass it all, we don't even know where the end of space is. And so the mind in the ancient world created gods and idols to worship and to pray to, right? They sensed a need for the transcendent being, right? But they created them. And Paul's saying, he has eternal power and he has a divine nature. And you figure it out, even if he's invisible, because you could never meet the person that was big enough to create this world. He would be too big, right? Right? So he's being rough on the Romans. They are without excuse, although he's speaking in the third person, so it's not so confrontational. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds became darkened. I often think today, with some of the unusual theories that are growing up now, that there's supposed to be hundreds of genders. Have you heard this? This fluid gender. You haven't heard all this?
No.
Gender fluid, what does that mean?
Well,
I've
if
heard
you start-
non-binary, but I don't know what gender
right, if you
fluid is.
leave male, female, and then there's supposed to be transgender, you can be whatever you want.
Yes,
Well, now there are people saying, well, I'm neither one nor the other, I'm fluid. So today I might feel female, tomorrow I might feel male, or I might feel neither. None. The people, this is a really good example of your minds becoming senseless, because how could it be that one day you're one gender? We know through science, every cell in your body, if you look into the DNA, it's got an X and a Y or two X's. We know this, right? It's finite. You have to deny science to say I'm gender fluid,
is that the same thing as non-binary?
It's, yes. Well, I don't know. No,
I don't even know
non-binary.
what that is.
Well, we don't know either. They're
Oh.
making it up as they go.
Yeah.
Nobody knows.
I don't know.
But
Binary.
hundreds of genders, or where does that come in?
Oh, you haven't read this? Oh my
No.
gosh. I hear about it only because my daughter is a pediatrician, and a lot of this transgendering goes on with children, believe it or not, which
Yes.
is, the Pope has said, is child abuse. And I hear about it also because we have a grandson, David, who calls himself Alice, who says he's a woman, but he's having lots of problems. I forgot to pray for David Alice, I call him. But they read all this on websites,
Yes.
and they believe it.
Yeah.
But it's a good example of their senseless minds are darkened. because when you take all those hormones, you're endangering your health for the rest of your life, right? And there's no long-term studies, so you don't know what your outcomes could be. We may find out some terrible things. But I only use that as a modern example of, another example would be people who fall into drug use and their minds become darkened, right? Or anyone who makes an idol out of fame or money or power, right? And then they begin to crush other people, their
Right.
minds are becoming dark. They're losing common sense, right? Their minds are becoming darkened. And they become futile in their thinking. If you're driven by a desire for power or revenge, let's say, you lose your ability to think well, right? That's all he's saying. And he's saying, claiming to be wise, they become fools, and they exchange the glory of the immortal God for images. In the world that he's talking to, on every street corner, there was another temple to a different god. And in the Roman imperial religion, all the gods were either from mythology or they were dead emperors. Once an emperor died, they put another statue in, and they would worship and offer. They believed that once the emperor died, he was some sort of an invisible god, and they had to have an image of him. But in Egypt and some of the other surrounding nations, they did have animals that were worshipped. And
Horus. I think Horus is one.
who was
Horus. I think it's Horus as like the head of a cat. I don't know.
Right, there was Isis, which I think
Osiris.
was right, it was a bird or something.
No, Isis was I think the sister of Osiris, but I think Horus is the one that looks like
It looks like a bird, yeah.
I think so.
And so that's what he's talking about. And you can imagine in Rome, we had people coming and going from all of the Roman Empire there. So, resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. In Egypt, they believed that serpents were wise, and you had to, you couldn't kill them, and so forth. So that's what he's talking about idolatry, and
What?
there's a lot packed into here, but here is the beginning of natural law that God made us to understand. Okay, who would like to read verse 24? Well, through to the end of the chapter.
I will.
Thank you.
Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to the degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind and to things that should not be done. They were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents, foolish, faithful, heartless, ruthless. They know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, yet they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them.
Okay, so this is very hard hitting right from the get-go, right? First, what do you notice? Idolatry leads to a darkened mind and senselessness, and now we get the behaviors that come from a darkened mind and senselessness. And right off the bat, he hits on same-sex acts, which, while we have it today, we don't have slavery today. So in some respects, what we have today is very different than what he's seeing or hearing about in Rome. And in many respects, it's the same. I mean, we have people claiming a sexual identity. That doesn't exist in the ancient world. But there is a freedom that you can do anything you want with your body, and especially if you're using slaves to do it. Can you imagine? So this is really evil, the misuse of slaves as sexual objects. And first off, what kind of sexuality does he zing? Same sex, right? So we have, but look, he implicates God here. Look at 24. Therefore, God gave them up to the lesser. What does that mean? God gives, we've darkened our minds, we've become senseless, and God just says, oh, the heck with that? What does that mean?
God just steps aside and lets them do
Free
what
will.
they do and bear the consequences.
Free will.
Free will.
Free will. God, I like to say, God is a gentle lover. I heard this someplace, and I know it's true from my own sinfulness in my life and the times where my mind was dark. He loves us, he reveals himself to us, but he doesn't force us in any way. Free will is always there, like Adam and Eve from the beginning. So he gave them up to God allows. God doesn't zap anybody like they said in the Old Testament, but he does have power and divine power, and he doesn't use it against people who use their freedom for sin. So he took, first of all, is impurity to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they had exchanged the truth about God. See, this is that truth. He believes that all of us in our inner hearts can know that there is a God, a supreme being, and can know about goodness. And they exchanged it for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than Creator. So all sin is your worship. Everything God made is good, but not everything that God made should be used in any way you want. That's license, right? And so they make a God out of what God created is good, but wasn't meant to be used that way. I think of, you can eat too much, you can use sex too much, God made the world, but you could decide that you just wanted to buy everything there was, Things aren't evil in themselves, it's what we do with God, all the wealth, the riches of our world. And so God gave, and then he repeats it again. For this, he gave them up to degrading passions. God still loves us, but we can degrade ourselves. And so we have women exchange natural intercourse. So we've got lesbianism back in ancient Rome. In the same way, men were consumed with passion for one another. And men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty of their error. What is that?
AIDS?
No, they didn't have
Yeah.
They didn't have AIDS.
Yeah.
No.
There were sexual diseases, though, like
Yeah.
gonorrhea and all that. That wasn't the ancient one. We don't know. It could be that. But also, remember I told you that the upper classes all paid lip service to the Roman imperial religion with the many gods and the sacrificing and the different feast days and games dedicated to this god or that god. But the upper classes followed various philosophies, the Stoics, the Cynics, the Epicureans, and they considered themselves the wise, and the people that really believed the mythology, they considered the simple-minded, right? Well, one of the things that the Stoics taught, and the Stoics were the most broadly followed philosophy, was nothing, there was no such thing in Stoic philosophy as sin. What the virtuous person, and they did have lists of virtues that they taught, was the person who kept balance in their life. And if you had the proper balance in Stoic philosophy, you would never eat too much, you would never sex too much, you would never do anything too much. And that was very unhealthy, imbalanced, and unwise in Stoicism. So for them, if there was such a thing as sin, is taking anything to an extreme. That was their belief. And there was an emperor, Marcus Aurelius, who was a Stoic philosopher and an emperor, and he wrote his meditations, and you can read all about it. So, yes. So, oh, and the Stoics believed that if you did anything too much, you harmed your body. So that was a current belief. They received in their own persons, you became weak, is what the Stoics believed. If you wanted to have a strong body, you had to be very careful how much you drank, how much you ate, what you did sexually. But there was no such thing as sin. You know, if you did it once or twice, I guess it was all right. And that's the best we can do with that line there. Due penalty for the error. Well, certainly, we know today with all the science we have, people abuse their bodies and they do pay a price in their body. Absolutely.
Yeah, but what was the spiritual explanation for that? Like, did they have like, okay, if you do too much of something with your body, you became weak. But like, is that also with the mind, or is that because you commit a sin? Like,
In the Stoic philosophy,
Yes.
I'm not an expert and I'm not a philosopher. I just know that one of their teachings. Your question is, what is the spirituality? I am not sure whether Stoicism teaches spirituality at all. I don't, I'd have to research that. I think he's referring to physical weakness. Okay. So there's the first part. He dings, he blames, idolatry is the source of all these sexual sins, which for the Orthodox Jew that Paul was and is, you know, we all come out of the Ten Commandments, the law, the high moral content of Judaism. That's our tradition too, and he's holding on to that. But now, from 28 to the end, he broadens it. He's no longer speaking simply about sexual sin, which is a result of idolatry and darkened minds, but a broad list of every sin you can imagine, right? Why do you think he does this? First he goes to the sexual sins, and then he gives a huge, broad list of every kind of sin. There's so much here. And since they did not acknowledge God, gave them up to a debased mind. Well, he already said that, right? And to things that should not be done, they were filled with every kind of wickedness. Covetousness, malice, envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. It's the whole... In the ancient world, one of the things that the Stoics and other philosophers did was they made virtueless and viceless. No sin, per se, because you have to have a God to commit sin. Sin is a religious concept. But so this is common, and Paul's picking up on it. One of the commentaries, I'm following Father Joseph Fitzmyer and also James Dunn, two big New Testament scholars. And one of the things James Dunn says is that he's got two cohorts of people in the congregations. He's got the former Jews and the former Gentiles. The Jews look down on the Gentiles because they've had a moral code, especially a sexual code, from centuries, and the pagans don't, right? So when he's talking to the pagans, he zaps all the sexual sins that in Judaism, same-sex behavior was punishable by death, right? Right? And it's in Leviticus and a lot of places. But now he's realizing he's got two tracks in his audience. The second section here covers every kind of sin, apart from sexual sin, and that's where he's saying, well, what about you Jews? All right, so maybe you're not doing same-sex behaviors with slaves, but what about all this? So nobody's off the hook. Do you see there's two sections here? Right? Wickedness, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. They know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die. Now the Jews believed in capital punishment and certain behaviors merited in their law death. I don't know that in Roman law, I haven't studied Roman law enough to know what are the sins that merit or the behaviors that merit capital punishment. Yet they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. So it's general lawlessness. First sexual lawlessness, and then general. Can you imagine the Roman, these letters were written, read out loud to the Roman churches on Sunday when they worshiped together and they had the Lord's Supper. Can you imagine them hearing this? And they're saying, who is this Paul? We've heard about him, right? And he's coming. Yeah. So now he's going to get even tougher. Who would like to read? Starting in chapter 2, it becomes, he's using a very special kind of rhetoric, which I'll explain. Who can read chapter 2, 1 through 11?
I'll read, Mary.
Oh, thank you, Tim.
Therefore you have no excuse, O man, whoever you are, when you judge another. For in passing judgment upon him you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, are doing the very same things. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who do such things. Do you suppose, O man, that when you judge those who do such things, and yet do them yourself, you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you presume upon the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience? Do you not know that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? But by your hard and impenitent heart you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. For he will render to every man according to his works. To those who by patience in well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are factious and do not obey the truth, but obey wickedness, there will be wrath and fury. There will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek, but glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek, for God shows no partiality.
Right, God loves all of us. And Paul understands that he's called to the Gentiles, but he's also a Jew. He can't leave them behind, right? So what does it mean? Who is he talking to? Therefore you have no excuse. My translation says whoever you are. Yours says, oh man, right? Does anybody else have something else?
Mine says friend.
Friend. Oh, I gotta look at the Greek. Okay, anybody else have something different?
One says, every one of you who passes judgment.
Really? Okay, okay, so Romans 2. I should have done this last night. Ephesians. Hebrews. Galatians. Right there. Okay, here it is. Here's Romans 2. Dio anapologetos. A. O anthrope. Pas. O anthrope. Anthropos in Greek is man. And ho anthrope. Ho is the. It's the definite article. And the ending pay is the is a case for when direct address. Oh man is really what it says, or oh human, right? Ho human. Oh pas. Pas is all. Does anybody have all there? Ho anthrope pas. Each pas can mean all or each or every. So every man is literally, the Greek says, oh every man. Isn't that interesting? It's really hard for them to translate. You can see why they take some liberties, right? It really says, oh every man. This is a rhetorical device. Have you ever heard of the straw man? If you were ever in a debate club or whatever, the straw man device is when you don't talk directly to
Oh, yeah.
the people you're speaking to. Now, up until now, he's been speaking about in the third person, those who do this and those who do that, right? Now he's using the second person, whoever you are, right? Or every man. He's speaking directly, but rather than offend them, because you have to build up in rhetoric, and Romans studied and Greek studied rhetoric because it was an oral society, and we're not so good at rhetoric today. The device was, and it came out of the theater as well, is you had a straw man, in other words, an invisible person, and you talk to them rather than directly to the audience, so people will come on board what you want to teach them and not be offended. He's going to speak very sternly to this pretend person, right? And so Paul knows rhetoric, which the Jews didn't study rhetoric, but the Romans and in the Roman Empire, it was any educated man studied grammar, rhetoric, and logic.
So it seems like Paul's trying to say here, judge not lest you be judged, but he doesn't want to appear judging either. So when he's saying whoever, he's not really pinpointing anybody.
That's right, exactly
But he doesn't
right.
want to appear.
Now I want to show you something before we go any further in chapter 22. Look over to, so he doesn't identify who he's talking to, but he will soon. Look over at verse 17. What does it say?
In number 2?
Yep. He finally tips his hand in 17. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast of your relation to God and know his will and so forth, but then you will commit sins, right? Right? So he's really talking. He finished with the sexual sins of the pagans. He started there because the Jews already knew you shouldn't have same-sex behavior, and and the Jews didn't have slaves either. So their moral code was way higher than the average person in the Roman Empire or in the Greek Hellenistic world. And so now he's switching focus from one to the other. And so just so they don't get puffed up, right? We don't do these things. It's not in our law. Do I have to sit elbow to elbow with these people and receive the Eucharist? Do you know how bad they are? Do you know what they do? Right? And that could have been the mindset where they're looking down and judging the pagan Christians, and they're all Christians together. So now, but he approaches them rather gently. So when you use the straw man, your audience can say to themselves, oh, well, he's not talking about me, right? Right? Whoever you are. Oh, every man. Therefore, when you judge others, so now he's going to bring down the Jewish contingent many notches. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself because you, the judge, are doing the very same things. Well, how does he know that? How does he write this letter and telling the Jews, will you do the same thing? He's going to end up saying we're all sinners. We all fall short of the glory of God, Paul's going to say, right? He's going in that direction. So that by the end of this negative section, he's hoping that everybody realizes, oh, I'm a sinner too. I'm not going to point fingers at the pagan Christians, right? We're all sinners. And then they're going to be ready and humble enough to receive God's grace, his justifying grace, right? That's where he's headed, right? He's given them all a bath.
Can I ask, if he's trying to level the playing field, why does he come right at the very beginning and say, well, when it comes to tribulation or to glory, first the Jews, and then also the Greeks? Why does he stack them? Already he's not leveling.
Thank you for asking that question. It's it's so, he says it in Corinthians, he says it in many places, first the Jew. He wants everyone to know that this is a gospel for all people, right? Not just Jews, because Jesus was a Jew. And there was a very high feeling in the Roman Empire, and there had been several pogroms against Christians, and they blamed uprisings on Christians. They were scapegoated, right? And he wants the pagans in the Roman congregations to know he's fighting that anti-Christian and anti-Jew. The Emperor Claudius in 49, and we think this is 58, threw all the Jews out of Rome, and because there had been uprisings and there had been fires in, that's later with Nero, and the Suetonius, one of the Roman historians, said it was because of the Christos In other words, Christianity was seen as a subset of Jews, and Christians were troublemakers, and so he's got to push against that as well. But the second reason is the Jew first, and then the Gentile. Jews were privileged in Paul's eyes, and to this day we believe, and you'll see when we get to chapters 9 through 11, he will address this head on. Jews were given divine revelation before the rest, all the other nations. The Gentiles just means all the other nations, right? So the Jews were the chosen people on the plus side, and they got all of that benefit. But on the minus side, God expects more of you the more gifts God gives you. And you had revelation that the Gentiles never had. So that's why in the judgment, the Jew first and then the Gentile. Do you see it? When you judge, you say we. And now part of rhetoric, when you have a straw man, the straw man can't talk. He's invisible. So you have to talk for him. And Paul does it. Look at verse 2. You say, we know that God's judgment on those who do such things is in accordance with the truth. He's making the straw man talk. And now he's going to answer the straw man. Do you imagine, whoever you are, that when you judge those who do such things and yet do them yourself, you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you, and these are rhetorical questions, right? The straw man can't answer. Or do you despise the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience? Do you not realize that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? A little bit of pastoral theology. Jesus always approaches sin with kindness. He only gets angry when he sees sin in the religious authorities, the people who claim a higher level of knowledge and who are teaching the poor people, right? But by your hard and penitent heart, you're storing up wrath for yourself, in other words, punishment, on the day of wrath. That means on the end of the world, right? When God's righteous judgment will be revealed. And then he goes on to tell them, he will repay according to each one's deed. And this is the easy part. Those who, by patiently doing good and seek glory and honor and immortality, will get eternal life. While those that are self-seeking, who don't obey the truth. Remember this theme in chapter 1? That we can know God's truth by opening our eyes. But wickedness, there will be wrath and fury. This is the apocalypse, right? Wrath and fury. There will be anguish and distress for everyone who does evil. The Jew first and the Greek first. There'll be eternal life for the Jew first and the Greek. And there'll be punishment for the Jew first and the Greek. But glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first, for God shows no partiality. This is the easy part, right? Now comes a really interesting part, and it's one of the big foundational notions of Christian morality, and that's our conscience. Paul, in most of his letters, talks about conscience. It's not in the gospel, because the notion of conscience is it's not a Jewish notion. It's in Jewish anthropology, a person, the human person, the center of everything is their heart. There's no separation between heart and mind. But in Greek and later Roman anthropology, the human person has three main parts: a spirit, a mind, and flesh, the sarx. The nous is the mind, forget what. The suke is the spirit, and sarx is your flesh. If you ever studied philosophy and anthropology, different cultures understand the makeup of a human person differently. And some in parts, and in Hebrew anthropology, it's wholeness. That's why Mary ponders all these things, not in her head, in her heart, right? Because she's a Jewish woman. That's Jewish anthropology. So Paul can think. He's a Jew who thinks like a Roman or a Greek. And he develops the whole notion of conscience, which you won't find coming out of Jesus' mouth, right? I would like to read 12 through 16. Oh, thank you, Joe.
Sure. All who sin outside the law will also perish without reference to it, and all who sin under the law will be judged in accordance with it. For it is not those who hear the law who are just in the sight of God. Rather, those who observe the law will be justified. For when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature observe the prescriptions of the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the demands of the law are written in their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even defend them. On the day when, according to my gospel, God will judge people's hidden works through Jesus Christ.
Incredible sentence, very long, but also incredible. What do you like in here?
That God recognizes people who do good.
God recognizes, and He looks into your heart, right? We say, and they show that the law. So, as he tries to bring together these two separate groups in the house churches, the Jews with their anthropology and their understanding of the law, and the Gentiles who've been told that everything is in wisdom in your mind, but their minds are really darkened, right? They show that God will judge them according to what they know, right? All who have sinned apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. In other words, they can't be judged by the law. Jews look down on the Gentiles. Do you know that the common epithet for a Gentile or a non-Jew was dog in the time of Jesus? It's in the Gospels. They call them dogs. Because dogs in the ancient world ran loose, and they were scavengers, and they were a nuisance, and they were dirty. And the Jews, the faithful Orthodox Jews, people who observed the kosher rules and all the purity laws, considered these people terribly unclean. They didn't wash before they ate, and they didn't bathe their feet, and they used certain pots for different things. Well, so we're going to be judged according to what we've been taught. It's not the hearers of the law that are righteous, but the doers of the law. So it sounds like Paul is assuming that certain Jews in the congregations felt, well, we have the law, we're righteous. Just by the very fact that we have it. Maybe we even break it, but we have it. We're better than these people. When the Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, though not having the law, are a law unto themselves. What does that mean?
You make their own rules?
Well, they figured out, you know this, haven't you ever met people that were never raised in Christianity, but who are very good people? Maybe they don't go to church, whatever. I've known plenty of these people. And that's an example of what Paul's talking about. They're
Stoics. They're Stoics.
The Stoics, well, not necessarily, because the Stoics put an awful lot of emphasis on what you could know and studying. So they have
They
a
knew
narrow.
their boundaries, though.
They do know boundaries, the Stoics, and they know what virtues are and vices. Stoics do. Though they're a law unto themselves in the sense that, just like Paul just made the argument that you can know the truth about God by looking out the window, as Carol says, right? You can know the good instinctively, he's saying right here. And if you know the good instinctively, in a sense you have a law. But it's a law of their own, a law unto themselves. They have some sort of a metric to measure, a standard, right? And they show, in the very next line, they show that the law, I'm talking too loud. I woke up a baby.
5 minutes.
Is that what's left?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Oh,
You did pretty well.
That's wonderful. Thank you, because I left my watch is broken, and I left my cell phone in the car. The law is written on their hearts, and that's a famous line, and it's a reference to Ezekiel, where he says God says through Ezekiel, "I will take your hearts of stone and give you hearts of flesh." The whole idea, and see, there's the Jewish anthropology. Knowing the good would be in your heart, right? The law is written, it requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience, it gets better. So there are people who've never been taught. You Jews, are you listening? There are people who've never been taught, and you can't look down on them, because if they can look outside and know the truth of God in their hearts, they're going to know the good, and they have a law of their own, and it's written on their hearts. He's teaching them not to discriminate against the Gentile. And how do they do this? Well, their own conscience bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts will accuse them or excuse them on the day when Christ will judge. Isn't that a beautiful description of what it's like for all of us when we're trying to discern, well, should I do this? Is this right or is this wrong? Or was it wrong for me to have said that? You know, I'm forever examining my conscience and thinking, Lord, was that right or wrong? Should I tell that in confession? You know, that's me weighing stuff and thinking, but then I do have, in my conscience, I have conflicting thoughts. Do you? Right? Paul, an ancient writer, is telling us something very true about human psychology, right? We have, and so they show that what the law requires is written on their heart and their conscience, will accuse or perhaps excuse them on the day of judgment. In other words, God is never going to ask us to be responsible for behavior that we were not able to discern in our conscience, right? If we have an active conscience. Now, if you darken your mind with bad behavior, maybe you have no conscience. But I love this. We will be, and it's in the catechism, I went and looked it up last night, in the whole discussion of mortal and venial sin. You cannot commit a mortal sin unless you have full knowledge and full consent. That's the result of this passage right here. You have to know and you have to consent. And you do that in your conscience. And Paul is establishing this, which is bedrock moral theology right here. And he's the first person to do it. He does talk, this isn't the first time he mentions conscience, but this is the best fleshing out of conscience, the conflicting thoughts. And that God will take all this into consideration. Don't you like it?
Yes.
I love it.
So you don't have the firm laws anymore, you have the expansion of that to be able to understand what's right and wrong based on...
You do have the firm laws, but he's speaking to the Roman congregations where we've got some people, Jewish people who have the law pointing fingers at people who don't have the law, right? And they've got dissension. You'll hear more about it. And so later on he's going to say, in fact very soon, when you read in chapter 3, what good is being a Jew? What good is the law? And he's going to say, very good having the law, right? See, there's a tension. What he's teaching is very much in tension. It's one thing to have the law, but you can't hit other people over the head with the law. You see it? You've got the law of God, the commandments, but you've also got the law of love. And they can create a tension in us in how we behave, right? It's a difference between doctrinal theology and moral theology, right? How we treat each other. So I have to stop here. So now pick up, so for next time, read the rest of 2 and 3, or go as far as you want, and because it's Romans, and it's tough going, read it like 3 times, and ask the Holy Spirit to explain it. But it's going to be easier, because starting at 17, he says, but if you call yourself a Jew, now he's leaving the straw man, right? And he's going to hit them with some taunts. You do this, you do this, you do this. He's going to say, but he's going to do it in question form. If you are so sure about this, and you're a guide to other people, and you do this, and yet you sin, you know, he's going to taunt these Jews. And he can do it because he's a Jew. Right? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.